Hi everyone, I'd like to give a very warm welcome to Professor Dr. Julia Rucklidge. Julia is Director of the Mental Health and Nutrition Research Group at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand. So thank you very much for joining us today, Julia.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah, all the way from New Zealand. What time is it over there at the moment?
It's only 8:30 in the morning.
8:30.
Just getting started.
So an early start to the morning. It's 6:30 here. So it's really nice. So Julia's research is all to do with micronutrients. But before we get into that, we might talk to Julia a little bit about maybe your journey from growing up in Canada to now being the director in New Zealand. If we could start there, Julia, if that was okay.
Sure. Yes. So born in Canada, born in Toronto. And I left when I was 17 and moved to Montreal and did my first degree in neurobiology at McGill University. And then I spent a year in, that's right, that's the year my third year I spent in the UK at the University of Bristol. And so that's the year I went and traveled around Ireland.
Oh, lovely.
And then I took a year off and went to graduate school at the University of Calgary, which is Calgary, Alberta, on the other side of the country, and did my master's and PhD in my training in clinical psychology. Very conventional training in clinical psychology. I don't know what that means. Basically, that means that you got a pretty standard exposure to what we think are the best treatments for people struggling with psychiatric illnesses. And so that was mainly medications and, of course, psychotherapy, because that's what I was doing. I then moved back to Toronto for a 2-year postdoc and then moved to New Zealand, got a job amazingly in this amazing country and as a child clinical psychologist at the University of Canterbury. So that was in 2000. So my journey, though, with the nutrition aspect started when I was doing my PhD in Alberta. I did my research under Professor Bonnie Kaplan, who's now retired. That doesn't mean she's retired because we've just actually written a book together. So okay. She's very, very busy.
Semi-retired.
I don't know what you call that. But she loves her job. And so what a wonderful mentor to just see, people who love their job and just, don't see it as an inconvenience or a stress or a horrible thing to have to go to work every day. In fact, she emulates the opposite. And I would probably say I probably do the same thing to my students these days. So, but when I was doing my PhD at the time, which was on women who struggle with ADHD, so I was interested in what was it like to struggle with these symptoms, what effect did it have on your self-esteem and your mood and anxiety. So, but she was approached during that time by some families from southern Alberta, Canada, who had discovered that using nutrients in a combined form, no special nutrient, but nutrients, micronutrients, minerals and vitamins in a combined form was alleviating the suffering of mental illness in their very, very small community. They were from a place called Raymond, Alberta, which is a rural part of Alberta. I don't know what the population is, but it's not very big. And their families had been, were really struggling with a lot of mental illness, like bipolar disorder and psychosis, really serious,
very serious
conditions.
disorders, yeah.
Yeah, and they were being treated by the best of the best in Alberta care, which means they were all medicated with on a number of different medications, and many of them were cycling through the hospital system and inpatient unit. And there'll be lots of, perhaps some of your listeners who are familiar with this experience, and they weren't getting better. I mean, I think that's really the important thing here, is that despite getting the best care, what we often don't talk about is that many people don't get better. And better to me means functioning well, in a good mood, not struggling with these symptoms all the time, not having the thoughts that are plaguing you all the time, being able to work, being able to raise a family, being able to hold down relationships. That's what recovered means to me. But it seems that in our world of mental health, recovered doesn't mean that necessarily. It's that maybe your symptoms are under control such that you may now be able to get out of bed in the morning, but you may not. You may still be on a disability allowance. Well, I guess I'm somebody who thinks that that's not good enough. So So she was approached by these families who had discovered that giving nutrients really did get these family members to a great place. And so they were interested in finding researchers who were keen to study this. And so one of the researchers they approached was Bonnie. And at first she was not impressed and not interested, and told them to take their snake oil somewhere else, and all these things. Pardon me?
Would she have been a bit skeptical at the time of this?
Yeah, absolutely. Except that she had been a nutrition researcher at some point in her career. So she had delved into diet with respect to children with ADHD. And so she was familiar with it. But somebody coming along and saying, we've got the cure, when that had been investigated for such a long time. The difference being, though, here was that most of the research on nutrients in a pill form had been done on single nutrients. And that's probably one of the key differences of what these Alberta families did, was that they understood that the brain needs all the nutrients. There's no special nutrients. So we were always looking for the magic nutrient cure, and we continue to do that. But the magic was probably in the combination. So she was willing to hear their stories, and I think that's an important thing that all scientists should do. All scientists, regardless of their skepticism, and this is something that I'm worried about and I see changing at the moment, because we seem to be a lot more polarized, is that you need to, if we're going to make new discoveries and change our trajectory, we do need to be always on the radar. Yes, be skeptical, but listen out for new ideas and new stories that don't fit with our model of thinking.
Yeah.
Don't reject it, which is what normally has. It's like, oh, that was probably an aberration, or it's just one case and it won't apply to the rest. You listen and you kind of go, well, how do I fit this into my understanding of mental illness? And that's what she did. And so she heard these stories of people getting well, and many people getting well, and thought, well, what I can do is I can apply science here, and I will study this in a small group of people. And so she ran some very small clinical trials around the time when I was doing my PhD. So I was quite intrigued with these different formulas she was working with. But the point was that many of the people she worked with who had bipolar disorder got better. And not only did they get better, but they could get better on a reduction in their medication, which is generally, I think, a good thing, because medications can, even if they do work, they often, for many people, result in a lot of side effects that are very unpleasant. Yeah. So if you can reduce your medication, then you tend to reduce the side effect profile as well. So that was an amazing, quite an interesting discovery, was these case studies. And she published those studies those cases, as did a few other people around the beginning of this century. But they, rather than being embraced as a new idea, they were mocked, and they were ostracized, and they couldn't continue with studies that they had going, like more controlled studies, and Health Canada got in the way. And I mean, it was just a big, long saga about why this research couldn't continue. So she came to New Zealand. Sorry, it's a long story, but she came to New Zealand in 2003, and that's where I had moved to at the time. And she presented some of these data to very skeptical audiences here. But I was intrigued. By that point, I'd completely lost that idea that we are curing people with our current treatments, and that they are miracles. And I'd worked with many people, and some people, of course, get better with our medications and our psychotherapies. Of course, people do get better, and when they work, they can be really life-saving.
Sorry, Julia.
But not enough people get better.
No,
go ahead.
Yeah. No, it's okay. If just can you explain for people that might know, and explain, I suppose, maybe the normal over-the-counter nutrients that people would be buying, and the difference maybe to what you've used,
what we were doing,
in your clinical trials, and the micronutrients, just for people to kind of have an understanding of that. I mean,
yeah. So the probably the magic in the combination that these families came up with was that it had full breadth. You've got about, I mean, there's a lot of minerals out, minerals in existence, but it seems that, and this could very well change over time as we learn more, but there's at least 15 essential minerals that plants need to take up from the soil. So they need to be present in the soil, and these are things like selenium and magnesium and iron, phosphorus, iodine. They all need to be taken up from the soil into the plant, and the plant uses the minerals in order to make the vitamins, like your B vitamins, your thiamine, riboflavin, or your vitamin C, etc. So the plant has to have those minerals in order to make those about 15 vitamins. Now there's a few more, I mean, plus or minus. So, but you have about 30. And then, so that's what the combination is. So that's one of the things is the magic, is that there's no magic. There's no magic nutrient. It's the full breadth of nutrients that our brain requires. And I'm very happy to explain what the brain does with those nutrients. And then it's the dose. So the dose is a lot higher than what you can typically get out of your multi-nutrient that you buy in a supermarket. So there's a lot of regulation. This is a huge area of controversy, is doses of nutrients that can be sold in supermarkets. They are often sold way below what's called the recommended dietary allowance, the RDA. Sometimes they're called DVs. I don't know what they're called in Ireland, but
RDA.
you'll see them on your packages, RDA. Okay, good.
Yeah.
So people are very familiar with the RDA concept because it's on every package of food that you buy. And it'll say something like, I don't know, 10% of the RDA for B1, something like that, on your package. And so you get this impression that you need to hit 100%, but never go over it. And so that's what our research is challenging, is this idea that the RDA is giving you the adequate amount of nutrients that you should be consuming for optimal brain health. It doesn't. Those numbers were developed just in World War II in order to make sure that our armed forces were adequately nourished to fight. So good body health, your muscles, your heart, your bones, not your brain. Didn't really seem to care about how well your brain was operating during the war. So that's how those numbers were developed. And what we know, though, and this is what's so kind of what I find confusing, maybe, because, and I'm coming from this as a psychologist. I do have a background in neurobiology, so that helps me. I've got a good science background. But why wouldn't you develop the RDA for the hungriest organ of the body, which is the brain? Why wouldn't they be developed for making sure that your brain was adequately nourished? So we never, and if you ask school children, they know they need to eat food, but they know that they probably think about it in terms of being able to grow. They don't know that they need to feed their brains in order to be able to concentrate at school or to learn. So that concept is being lost for whatever reason. There's probably a lot of good reasons for that, but we've lost sight of that the most important reason why you need these nutrients is actually for brain health. So all of that to say is the RDA is not useful when it comes to brain health, but the ones that you buy in your supermarket are all way below the RDA. The ones that we study are above the RDA. That doesn't mean it's toxic. It doesn't mean we're killing people. Of course, that would be a concern. No, we have no experience that we follow people, and some people up to 10 years after taking the nutrients. There's nothing that's suggesting that we're doing any harm to any of their other organs.
Sorry for cutting across you. That was one of the most interesting parts of the research from me reading through some of your research, is that even when people were tested for their nutrient levels, even if they met kind of, I suppose, what would be normal levels, it didn't mean that their genetics or, if they were going through a lot of stress or trauma or whatever difficulties, that they might need more. Could you just talk small?
Yes. Yeah. Thanks for bringing that up. So that's also an important point, is that we've got these nutrient levels that you can get tested for, and it's usually a blood test, and you go to your doctor, and it's going to reflect what you essentially ate over the last 24 hours. First of all, and a lot of the nutrients in blood are kept. Our body is very clever, and it keeps it at homeostasis, so they don't really budge that much. So if you were to get, say, a calcium level done, it shouldn't vary massively, even if you were taking a lot of calcium, because the blood will either throw it out into or the other areas of the body, or it'll bring it in because it needs more calcium. It's saying, hold on, we're going to take it from the bones in order to keep that tight homeostasis. Not all nutrients function that way. So for example, B12 can go up. There's no toxicity ever associated with B12. It's water soluble. You can, if you take too much, your body knows to get rid of it. But B12 levels can go up, and that's something we often see in our research. Vitamin D, you can see vitamin D levels do go up. So there are some nutrients that do go up, but not all of them. So they're not necessarily a great marker, first of all. But second of all, what you're raising is some of the research that I did, because I thought, well, maybe this stuff only works for people who are deficient, who are low in those nutrients when they start our research. Now, we don't select them for that, but we take blood tests, and we were doing the most typical nutrient levels that would be done by your general practitioner, your family physician, or your doctor. So we did all those, and they weren't, and it's surprising to me, they were not predictive of who got better. We still had people who had what would be seen as normal nutrient levels, still getting better with giving additional nutrients, which suggests, as you just said, that maybe some people have a higher need for some nutrients. That might be because of their genetics. So deficiency is, it may be, we need to think about deficiency relative to our own nutritional needs rather than to the average population, which is what is happening when you go and get a nutrient level tested. They're just saying, okay, you're in the average range, you're fine. But in fact, you may not be fine if you have a genetic difference or greater need, like what the other thing you raised was stress. Our research really has shown, I think pretty convincingly, that when you are under an awful lot of stress, and whether that is, I mean, in my research, it was the Christchurch earthquakes. We had thousands of earthquakes in 2011, 2012. You heard about the big one.
Yeah.
Or we had a couple of really big ones that made international news. We had the one that actually our 10-year anniversary is just coming up on February 22nd. That was a huge earthquake, 6.3 magnitude. It was under our city. Most of the buildings, a lot of buildings collapsed. Our city center was destroyed, and 185 people died. So that one was a big earthquake.
Massive tragedy, yeah.
Absolutely. But what we were able to learn from that was that we gave people additional nutrients, and we found that people were more resilient when they had more nutrients. And then we replicated that after a flood that happened in Calgary, Alberta. And then we replicated it again after a mosque shooting here in Christchurch, where we gave people who had been victims or survivors of the mosque shooting extra nutrients, and that seemed to help with their recovery. So would that apply to COVID-19 stress? I'd say, well, I think the brain doesn't differentiate between different stressors. I mean, it doesn't kind of go, oh, well, this is financial stress, so I'm going to react this way, or this is a relationship stress, so I'm going to, no, the brain is kind of like pretty much stress, fight, flight, triggered. Yeah. So I don't think it matters, but I don't know if you can tell from some of my research, we do research in opportunities. Like we had this opportunity of studying the earthquakes and then the mosque shooting, and we had a study going to study the effects of nutrients on COVID. Okay. But you may have heard that New Zealand did really well in keeping COVID out. So we don't have a lot of cases. So we dodged the bullet there.
You'd have a huge opportunity here anyway. We've been under a bit of pressure recently. It's turning a corner now a bit, but I think you make a very good point just with COVID stress for people. It's I suppose, look, in the middle of a pandemic, it's so different. Everybody's under a massive lot of pressure. There's an awful lot of uncertainty out there. Even the simpler struggles of maybe people trying to homeschool children and work from home at the same time.
Yeah, a lot.
Yeah, and really, really challenging on people. Like for things like maybe like anxiety, depression, is there kind of typical nutrients that we could safely advise people that they could be taking at times of maybe higher stress that they're going through or that they're dealing with these issues? Is there specific nutrients that I suppose we can advise?
What's the magic?
Yeah.
So this is, I mean, I'm happy to tell you what we've researched.
Yeah.
I always try to make sure that people understand, though, that I'm not funded by the company, so I'm
I
not here
know
to make
that,
any
yeah.
money for
Yeah,
it.
no, I'm fully aware of that. Yeah, I've seen the
Yeah,
research.
but I do need to make that clear, because otherwise it looks like I'm a salesperson, and I'm not. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
we've studied the concept. We're studying the idea that nutrients might be relevant for brain health, and we've done a decade of research using a few different formulas, but we tend to have stuck with those Alberta formulas. And so there's two of them. One's called Empower Plus, and one's Daily Essential Nutrients. And again, I just a plug for my book. We talk a lot about the research that we've been doing in there, and we also give people the information on how to access the nutrients.
I'll plug it at
And
the
you
end,
can,
don't worry.
yeah, okay, good.
Yeah.
But I just want to say that that's the first time we've done that, because we're always really careful and cautious about, if you go to on my website, you won't see the names of the products that we study.
Yeah.
But if you go, it's not that we're trying to hide it. We're just trying to avoid being accused of being in the pocket of the nutraceutical companies.
Yeah.
So I don't get any of our funding from those sources. They're all independent sources, which is unusual. So most of the people who do studies on drugs tend to get money from the pharmaceutical industry.
Of course.
We made sure from the beginning we weren't going to do our research that way. So it's all independent. But people want to know, so it's always listed in our journals, but the lay public doesn't know necessarily how to get hold of a journal article and then to find the table where we've listed the products and the nutrients that were studied. So that's why we decided in the end we're going to put it in the book. And it's also listed in other places. Like I've done an online course that's free for the public, that's called Mental Health and Nutrition under edX.
Yeah,
And again, where I'm providing all that information in there. So, but what I do, and I know I always have to have long answers, and it's not that I'm trying to be difficult, but we studied those two products. I've also studied some B complex, and B complexes, you might see them. Those ones are often in supermarkets, like
most of
I
our
don't
health
know.
food stores would have B
Yeah,
complex here.
a B complex. B complex, I don't think you have to go for any specific brand. Those have been studied the most for stress. So if you are under a lot of stress, I'd go and get a high quality. I'd at least talk to the pharmacist and say, which is your best B complex? Because that means that they might be better sourced, or they're better chelated, or they are of a higher dose,
of course,
potentially, so that it's a little maybe more effective. So that's a starting point. But I do have some caveats that I need to mention on that one. But there are also other ones that have been studied in the US that have been studied on autism. So other formulas and other studies have been done on aggression. Other formulas have been studied using it for aggression. So there's a number of different ones, but there aren't a lot of them, because not a lot of people, not a lot of nutraceutical companies want to invest in mental illness, because it's a market that I'm sorry to say it, but it's not a high decile market. So better to be able to sell just to the entire population than to this select group of people. I wonder if that happens. And it's complicated. It's complicated in the sense that one of the things that we're discovering is that medications complicate the recovery.
Of course.
And so, in a number of ways that people may not kind of think of. So, and also doctors it won't even be on their radar to be thinking about this. And that is that nutrients and drugs can interact with each other. And so this is, again, really important for people who are, if you've got listeners out there who've never heard about this work before, and they think, oh, I'll just go and try a nutrient supplement that she's been studying. If you're also taking an SSRI, our experiences and the research and the clinical evidence and experience of people who write to me, they all say that they often have challenging interactions.
Just for people that mightn't know, that are listening, I mean, obviously SSRIs are prescribed generally for anxiety or depression. Most of your clinical trials, actually, from my reading, it's actually you transition people over from pharmaceutical medication over to nutrients, and obviously that's done in a very safe process. but like generally the clinical trials are kind of typically 8 to 12 weeks with kind of high micronutrient doses. Like some of the studies are outstanding, like really the outcomes. And it does seem that long-term use of the nutrients, that they keep getting better and better overall. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So you've picked up on a
Uh,
few really interesting parts of our research, I think, there, Robert. So we've got the our studies that we do in New Zealand, everybody's always medication free, and we never tell someone to come off their medication. So
of
they have
course.
to make that decision independently of us. Now, the challenge of that is that what we're starting to see is that even if you come in and you're medication free, but you've got a past history of medication use, that that can lead to withdrawal symptoms and an extended withdrawal. We call it protracted withdrawal.
Mhm.
And I just want to alert people to that, because I don't think it's something that you're necessarily told when you go on a medication, that you may experience a lot of challenges coming off. And then you're often told, well, that's just the reemergence of the underlying problem, you need to go back on the medication. But it's a very real thing that people go through when they come off of medications, is that they can experience a lot of anxiety, a lot of like just inner tension and irritability, and some physical symptoms. They might experience nausea. There's a lot of things that can happen physiologically when you come off of a drug that your body is used to having there. So I just want that people to know that if they are planning on coming off of a drug, to think about the nutrients. Two things. First of all, don't just do this on your own. Go
Of
talk
course,
to your doctor, your prescriber, but you need to do it really, really slowly. And that's a key thing, is that you need to really wean yourself off. So the studies that have been done internationally on that, what you're describing as this cross tapering, which is coming off your drug and going on the nutrients, which is the way the psychiatrists say is the best way to do it, is that as you come on the nutrients, as you increase your nutrient dose, you slowly decrease your drug dose with your prescriber helping you.
so
Unfortunately, a lot of prescribers don't know about that kind of cross tapering. So
yeah.
that's something that we need to get a lot of more education on, is that cross tapering. The companies are very, very willing to educate the doctors, but it's something to be aware of. And the companies are happy to help people with that kind of experience of how to comfortably come off of medications while coming on the nutrients. So just so you know that. So when you say about the length of time, how long is it going to take before I feel better? If you are medication free, it can be super fast. So they're the least complicated people that we work with, is that no history of medication. We can see effects within a couple of days. Improve, and the main one that we'll see, first of all, is emotional dysregulation. That seems to improve. People feel a lot calmer over much longer periods of time, like the research that you're describing, that where we follow people for a year. At that point, if they stayed on the nutrients, they tend to be in remission.
Okay.
Most of them are.
And obviously, look, I've kind of looked through the research myself, but as much as I could. There's so much of it there, obviously, years of it there. But you've done things like anxiety, depression, bipolar, ADHD, PMS, so many different things. Like, I suppose, is there always, can I just ask, Sarah, there was one question I wanted to ask in relation to that. Did you have any findings from your research of like maybe other underlying conditions people might have had? So like, chronic pain issues or fibromyalgia or Crohn's or any of these sort of issues, or others possibly, where or maybe a common one for women might be endometriosis. Like, would you have seen anything come from the findings that maybe people that had underlying conditions as well, that these might have improved or symptoms might have improved? Was there?
Yeah, hard to study, but that explains, hopefully, to your listeners, where I might sound like I'm a bit ditzy and I go from bipolar to PMS. That's actually driven by the research. And so when, for example, we were doing our very, very first controlled trial on ADHD in adults, we observed that the women were telling us that their PMS was getting better. And so when I had a graduate student come along and said, I want to study in your lab, because I have a lot of students
Of
who
course, yeah.
approach me and want to be in my lab. I say, well, I don't know. See, these women are telling me that their PMS is getting better. Why don't you do a study on that? And that's what led to that PMS study. Another observation that we heard, clinical observation, was that people who were smokers were telling us they didn't crave cigarettes as much. So then I had another student come along, Pip Hannah, and she wanted to do a study. And I said, well, I don't know. Seems to help people quit smoking. Let's do a study on smokers. So that's how a lot of those studies come along, of why we start to explore something new. Yeah. So, for example, with with the ADHD kids, we saw one of the biggest effects was on reduction of anger and aggression and irritability and emotional dysregulation. They're just a lot calmer kids. Yeah. So our next study with kids is going to be to focus on those kinds of symptoms. So now, in the realm that you were asking about other things outside of psychiatric problems, so all I can say is what I've heard is that we definitely have had people who come into our study who also have chronic fatigue. And I have heard a number of people tell me that their chronic fatigue got better. And that to me makes absolute sense, because we don't really know what causes chronic fatigue, but I wonder, and this isn't just me wondering, there's some research that supports it, that there's something going wrong with the mitochondria. And the mitochondria are those little bacteria that are in all of our cells that are involved in the making of ATP. And ATP is essential for energy production. So if the mitochondria become dysfunctional and this cycle of making ATP is disrupted in some way, the cycle needs nutrients, and so it needs all of your micronutrients to function. So to have the Krebs cycle, which it's called, it also goes by the citric acid cycle, for it to rotate and go through to make ATP, you need minerals and vitamins all the way along the way. So what we wonder is that we're flooding the system with a lot of those minerals and vitamins that the mitochondria need to function. So are we having some effect on that to increase your ATP production, to increase your energy? That's my hypothesis. I don't know. We haven't been able to study that specifically, but that's what I wonder. In other situations, we wonder whether or not we're having an epigenetic effect. I don't know how much detail you want me to go into just why, but
you can expand on that. Yeah, it's okay.
Sure. So there's another cycle that's called the methylation cycle, and it's the purpose of the methylation cycle is to produce methyl groups, and a methyl group is a carbon with 3 hydrogens. And the magic of this amazing molecule is that it turns genes on and off. So these methyl groups attach themselves to the DNA, and that can cause them either to coil up so that the genes don't get read, or they get opened up so that the genes are read. And kind of a simplistic way to think about it, but it at least gives you this idea that, wow, these methyl groups that are made by the methylation cycle that require minerals and vitamins to function. So if you're not eating or consuming or getting enough minerals and vitamins, your methylation cycle is going to be impaired. Then your genes aren't going to be necessarily turned on and off that you want turned on and off, and that's going to affect your overall function. So that's another really important thing, that maybe what we're doing is we're having an effect on methylation cycle, and we have some data to support that, is where I was going. I don't have data on the mitochondria, but I do have data on that. So there's chronic fatigue we've observed clinically. The gut issues, I think you often need to independently to figure out how to restore the gut. That often requires a massive overhaul of your diet in order to repair the gut lining, and taking away some of the foods that might be triggering inflammation. So I would recommend, if somebody had a lot of gut issues, they should go see a dietitian to see what might be triggering, what might be your food allergies, your food triggers. The number one thing is just get rid of ultra-processed food would be my message.
Yeah, that's where I was going to go with that. Really, it's kind of just looking, maybe one of the number one killers globally is sugar. We're obviously talking about refined processed sugar, but in relation to cardiovascular disease, obesity, type 2 diabetes, amongst many other issues, other cancers and stuff. Like, is that something that, like, creates deficiencies as well in the brain. And like, is that another reason why maybe overconsumption of processed foods, and
Yeah.
maybe
Yes.
what types of food should people be eating, actually, if you don't mind expanding on
Sure.
that? Yeah, for
Yes, I will.
better brain
I'll,
health.
yes, I'll do that. I'll just finish. The only other clinical observation that we've heard quite a bit is headaches getting better. So
Okay,
I just,
brilliant,
yeah,
brilliant. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah,
And other things, but those would be the big ones I'd say is the energy levels, and the headaches definitely get better. People who have like those cluster headaches, we've
yeah.
heard them completely go away. So your question about food is fantastic, because our research says even though it's about taking nutrients in a pill form, I'm not here to say everyone needs to take micronutrients in a pill form, not as the first step, because the first step would be to clean your diet. Absolutely. And again, I know I keep going back to the book because I spend so much time on that thing over the last year. We explain it really well in there, is that food is for absolutely first in your journey to mental wellness. You have to stop and think about the nutritional foundation of your brain. And so that means having an overhaul of your diet. We know, I don't know about the UK data, but I suspect it's similar. 50% of calories in North America come from ultra-processed food. And you might say, well, what's ultra-processed food? Ultra-processed food, you've got I think of food in three categories: whole food, real food, what your grandmother would recognize as food, your fruits and vegetables, your apple plucked from the tree, your milk coming from the cow, the fish that you went and caught from the ocean. That's
Seeds,
your
nuts,
whole
yeah.
real food. Yeah. So then there's your processed food, which is not necessarily bad. That's where you can tin things, like you jar tomatoes to preserve them. And there's it's in there is maybe tomatoes and maybe a bit of salt, but not much. And there's no added sugar, nothing else added to that. Pasteurized milk is a processed food because it's been heated in order
Yeah.
to try to make it a safer product. Freezing things is processing. So taking all of your fresh berries and then freezing them, absolutely perfect to eat that type of fruit or vegetable that are being frozen. So your frozen peas, absolutely fine. Great way of getting your nutrients in a cheap form. Beans that have been canned, that's fine. That's processed though, because you put it into a tin. So it's a form of processing. You haven't just taken the dried beans and soaked them and then cooked them, which would be your real food form. Okay. So, and then there's the ultra processed food category, and that's pretty much what unfortunately most people eat, and they've been lured into eating that. That's your microwave dinners. That's your packages that have lots of ingredients on there that you don't recognize.
MSGs and yeah.
You've got it's got all those added sugars, but it's going to have a whole bunch of other added things. So, but the key thing about the ultra processed food that people don't know necessarily is that it's nutrient poor. It's low in those vitamins and minerals that I've just explained to you are so essential for brain health. Making neurotransmitters requires vitamins and minerals. Making your serotonin, your dopamine, all those really important neurotransmitters involved in emotion regulation, putting the brakes on, etc. You don't get it from your ultra processed diet. But that's, I don't blame the public for that, because I think the diet messages have been atrocious. They've been all about just making sure your fats and your carbs and your proteins are well balanced. You consume a certain number of calories a day. I don't know if that's 2,000, we could say 2,000, maybe it's a bit more. And that people focus on those metrics, and then they think, oh, I got that right. I got it. I've met
I've hit
those
that, yeah.
percentages. But you could be eating a diet that is completely void of nutrients, doing it that way. So you might think it's balanced, but it's got no micronutrients or very little micronutrients. So if you eat the foods that are in that real food category, they are abundant in your vitamins and your minerals. And so that's why I say you need to start there. If you can just clean up there's
Right.
no good reason for eating ultra processed food unless it's a treat. An occasional takeaway, that's fine, on once in a while, but do not make that your 50% of your diet. It should
Mhm.
not be coming from your ultra processed food. So we've got to change. A huge global population change in what we eat is necessary to not just change our mental illness, but to change everything, because that'll have a good effect on obesity, type 2 diabetes, cancers,
That's
everything. So it's going to have an all-consuming positive effect if we can just shift to the whole real foods. And so it's not complicated. It's not a complicated. I'm not going for a fad diet. I'm
yeah,
not saying you need to eliminate this. Well, I am saying
yeah,
eliminate.
yeah. Get rid of
I'm
processed.
I'm just saying get rid of ultra processed food. And that is the message. Key message, not complicated. If it's got too many numbers on there that you don't understand, you shouldn't be consuming it.
It's very, very challenging for people because I
I
mean,
know.
even if we look at supermarkets and the law is now somewhat changed, but all the healthy stuff is at the back, and you have to walk through all these aisles with all the
I know.
processed foods to get there.
Yeah,
Uh,
we need a lot of education. And
mm,
the other thing that do you have the star ratings in Ireland? Have you guys got that? Or
st-
healthy, have you got the traffic light system on some of your foods?
there
You
is
guys
on
gone with that?
some, yeah.
Yeah.
Not in all, no, but
So I hate them.
yeah.
Absolutely hate the traffic light system. So they are what they're saying. So they give you, the consumer, an idea of green light means good, bad, red is bad, or 5 stars is good, or 1 star is bad. But what consumers don't probably kind of get into the nitty gritty, and this is something that I do, is that the star rating is based on, and if you can just get this concept, the star rating or the traffic system is based on this: low in saturated fats, low in sodium, low in calories, low in sugar, and 1 star for having a nutrient in it. That's how the traffic light system works. So I just want to point out that most things like a cardboard box, things that are not real foods, would hit at least 4 stars. So that doesn't mean you should eat it. So, right? So,
Yeah.
a plastic container would have 4 stars. So you shouldn't be determining a star rating, a traffic light system based on what's not in the food. It should be about what's nourishing in it that's good for you.
Yeah,
So
100%.
so that's where I think a lot of the messaging is all about what not to eat rather than
What we
what
should
you
eat.
should eat.
Mm.
And so if you can switch your focus from that to, just being afraid of everything you shouldn't eat. I think about when I was pregnant. I had 2 children, they're now teenagers. In the early part of 2002, 2003, I was just like, well, I'm being told not to eat everything pretty much. And so what am I,
What
so
am I allowed
rather
to eat?
than what am I allowed to eat? So it
Mm.
should really, I think the focus should be about, when you're pregnant, you should be making sure that you eat, get good sources of protein, lots of legumes. There's nothing wrong with the beans. There's chickpeas, your quinoa, your fruit and vegetables in season. Really focusing on all of that rather than don't eat fish, don't eat anything that hasn't been washed. And it's just this constant list of you terrified. So you end up with a really restricted diet,
Restricted
which
diet,
is
yeah.
not good for your growing fetus.
Of course. Can I just touch in as well? Just, I suppose, uh, I see a lot of people, and sometimes, it's almost like the chicken or the egg. It's like sometimes you're struggling with your mental health, and that can often lead then, the last thing on people's minds if they're really
Yeah.
struggling is
Change your diet.
nutrition, is self-care. A lot of these things are
Yeah.
people struggle to put time and effort into. But the other side of it then sometimes is people might never have struggled with their mental health, but have been living a very unhealthy lifestyle and having a very poor diet for a very long period of time. And often this can lead then to mental health issues, like, even if they're
Mm,
more minor issues, like, anxiety or low mood. What I mean? It's
mm,
often very apparent when, you're doing an assessment with someone and you're kind of looking through that these are areas of our lives sometimes that we don't really focus or put much time and attention
mm,
into. And
mm,
sometimes some of that's societal, and we're being very busy and people are rushing and
mm.
racing.
Yeah.
um but it's kind of trying to bridge that gap between what we know and what we do is often the biggest difficulty for people, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So sometimes if people are at that space of having just that so no energy and just not having the will and the motivation or the ability and skills to
Mm.
start overhauling their diet the way I'm describing, that's often where the nutrients in pill form can be a great starting point, because it hopefully gets people to a better place where they can then start to think about their diet. So that often I've seen a lot of people like that, where we get them in our research and then they see the benefits of the nutrients, and so then they start to think, maybe I should be thinking about my diet now, and then they have that ability to start changing that, because they recognize how important nutrients have been for their brain health. That's something that I've observed. And if that's somebody out there who just doesn't feel that they can at this stage change their diet, then that could be a good first step
Yeah,
for
yeah.
people like that, even though, my main message is, generally as a
Oh,
population, we need to change.
of course. Yeah.
Yeah, the population data are pretty clear around an associations between people who eat poorly and their poor mental health, and people
Mm.
who eat well and good mental health. So there's enough of population data, and also randomized control trials where they've manipulated diet and they've helped people shift to a more whole food diet, and that they've shown the benefits of those that shift for their mental health. That there's enough of research out there that we really need to be talking about it in the first session with our patients. And that's something that if I can have that impact on clinicians out there, that, hey, you know what, this isn't hard to talk about people's diet. It's not something you should feel you have to stay away from because you're not a dietitian. We can ask very simple questions around, how many servings of fruit do you eat? How many servings of vegetables do you eat? Do you drink a lot of fizzy energy soda type drinks? How often do you eat takeaway, etc.? I mean, just having some very basic conversations around food, just to start making those steps towards a more whole food, real food diet. I don't think it's something that's very complicated.
Mm.
It doesn't have to. We've made it complicated,
It's
or
very
we've said, oh,
straightforward.
it's very straightforward. And
Mm.
or there's this fear I think people have of stepping outside of their scope of practice, because, you're trained in one thing, and how could I possibly talk about diet? Well, I would then say to clinicians like that, who need sort of that not motivation, but just that reassurance. I suspect a lot of clinicians out there talk about exercise. Well, are you a physiologist?
Mm.
Are you trained in that? Well, no, we just know the basic message there is, you need to increase your activity. How you do that, whether you do that by walking or running or cycling or swimming, is probably not something that is, psychologists or clinicians or counselors get into, but they know the principle that they need to be encouraging their patients to be exercising more. The same thing holds for food, is that you need to hold that the basic concept is, you need to be getting your patients to be eating more real whole food. So it's got to be there in your toolbox, and not to be afraid to talk about diet.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. Julie, do you mind just you touched on it earlier a little bit, just around some of the trials around the addiction side of things. You did some work around the cigarettes, and
Yeah.
just maybe some of the outcomes of that, possibly, if that's okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's a tricky area to
Mm.
work in, is what I learned. Smokers have a high tendency of dropping out of your studies, unfortunately. So we had the highest rate of dropouts I'd ever experienced. So so I do want to put that caveat out there, but we
Mm.
did have even when we considered, we had to assume that every dropout was a it was somebody who hadn't quit. So we had to make a very conservative estimate that those people were all people who
Still
continued to
smoking, yeah.
quit smoking.
Mm.
Even when we kept that, that was our very conservative interpretation of our data. We still had, when we considered all the people who had, who had got to the point of what we call the full intervention, which was where they had been taking nutrients to sort of get themselves to a point where they were ready, nutrients or placebo, ready to start trying to quit. And then at that point, they also started Quitline, which is just I'm sure you have the same thing in Ireland.
Yeah.
That those people, 40% of them were still quit at 3 months from their start point, versus about 20% of the placebo. So we still had a really good quit rate, but just remember that's considering this kind of full sort of group of people who had made it to the starting line. We had a lot of people who had dropped out before that, but we had a lot of people who dropped out after this too. So that's not bad, and that relative to current treatments out there like Champix, I don't know what varenicline, I don't know how else it goes by.
Champix is prescribed, prescribed by GPs for cigarettes, like that.
Yeah, so if you look
sometimes.
at so if you look at the quit rate for Champix at 3 months, it's about 22%. So
it's quite high.
It's about the same as our placebo rate.
Yeah.
So we did quite well, but I don't think it's the whole thing, the whole answer with quitting. I mean, I think you need to do other things as well. And I wonder, to be honest, I think there's a good parallel between people who are trying to quit smoking and people who are trying to come off. Going back to psychiatric medication, sorry to harp on about that, but I just, how difficult it is to come off of psychiatric medications could be similar to that. So some of the things that we've observed with helping people come off psychiatric medications, adding in amino acids, there's other sort of protocols that can be put in place to help sort of make it a kinder journey of coming off of these things. Needs to be explored. So there's not a lot of, I guess what I'm saying is that we've got some interesting data there where we helped some people quit smoking, but the big picture is that we still haven't found the magic to help people come off of these drugs that our brain gets completely addicted to and used to having around. I don't know if you have any magic.
And it's very complex, obviously, even where you're not even saying there about taking nutrients, that's the only answer, but it's definitely a big part of the jigsaw when it comes to mental health and dealing with these psychiatric issues. So it's wonderful. Julia, you have your book, Better Brain. Is it actually, it is out? I think you can buy it now on Amazon. Can you? Am I right in saying that?
You can pre-order it now.
Pre-order, yeah.
So
okay.
You can pre-order it. So it's coming out in the middle of April. It's coming out. We've got 2 publishers. So I co-wrote The Better Brain with Bonnie Kaplan, who I mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
So we teamed together to put all the research in one place, the research on micronutrients, but also the research on food. So it covers everything. And also really, it's for the lay public. I think it'll be useful for clinicians who are just starting out on trying to get their head around this absolutely massive body of research that we've been ignoring. I think to be honest, I think up until now, I think there's a lot of books that are coming out that do address diet and brain health, that we're going to see a big change and hopefully a revolution in how we treat people with mental illness. I'm hoping it's just around the corner.
Yeah, it looks like an amazing book, and it's I suppose for people that might be watching this, it's all about how nutrition will help you overcome anxiety, depression, ADHD, and looking at overcoming stress as well through
So it's published in paperback with Penguin Random House. That's how you buy it in the UK and in Ireland.
And you can pre-order it on Kindle as well, actually. I said
you sure can, and there'll be an audiobook apparently, and
very good. Very good. There is a course coming up as well for people that are actually interested, whether it's GPs or nurses or anybody kind of working in the mental health or well-being, or even a person that might be interested in just their own mental health and eating better, and just the link between nutrients and brain health. And that's done, I think that's on the 3rd of March, and it's done through edX. And for people that don't know, edX was set up by Harvard and MIT, and it's an online learning portal, and it's actually fantastic. Actually, you can download the edX app actually onto your phone, so it's very, very accessible. And Julia's course on the 3rd of March is actually free, which is fantastic. And if people do want to get certified as well, they can go on and get a certificate, which is at a relatively small cost. Julia, can I just say thank you very much? I think the work you're doing is incredible. It's really amazing, and I think Obviously you're one of the world leaders at this type of doing this type of research, and I think this will inform, I think, our mental health services. It will inform going forward how people are treated for many of these issues, and hopefully that will be all. And I'm very sure it's all very much for the positive.
Yes, well, I hope so. I hope these different resources that are coming out this year are really going to just widen the net of people who have access to this information in a way that I hope is really digestible and easy, like the MOOC, the mass online course that you described on edX is just short videos. You can tell that I talk a lot, so to get me
No,
to
you're very
just
good.
keep that to 5 minutes required
Yeah.
a lot of help from other people to just condense the message down. But they're very, like, I had a lot of fun with it. It was it's videos. There's 29 videos. There's me getting lessons on cooking from an Italian chef. We go shopping with a nutritionist. I speak with Bonnie. I speak with a toxicologist. I go out into the world of bees to explain about epigenetics. I go out to a beehive. So we've tried to make it a lot of fun and interesting, as opposed to just a studio type of education, which some of them are. So it was a lot of fun. A lot of fun to do. I hope I've made it entertaining, and
Fantastic.
I really hope it draws people in to want to learn more about it.
I'm booked on anyway, so I'm really looking forward to
Good.
it. Julia, just might leave you just finish up. What would be kind of the key points you might leave people with? Just just doesn't matter. Just in relation to maybe mental health, processed foods, whatever you think. Just maybe a couple of key points just to finish up.
Sure. I think it would be, first of all, key thing is to eat real food. I hope I explained that. Reduce your consumption of ultra processed food as much as you can. And learn about real food, learn how to cook it, learn how to grow it, start going to when you can, when you get out of your lockdown, just talking to the local farmers. But you can learn, I mean, you don't have to have necessarily a lot of space to start growing even some, a few choices of fruit and vegetables, depending on your climate, of course. So I'd start there, just getting reconnected with food, real food. We've lost some of that connection. So I think that's one of the key messages. If that's not sufficient, and there's a lot of reasons why that might not be sufficient, eating real food, that's where I think the nutrient research comes in really handy, to know that there's these micronutrients in pill form that can be taken very safe. We've got lots of data on it, lots of research to show that that can be a really effective way for some people to overcome their struggles. So and also just to know there's hope. There's a lot of different options out there. This is just one of them. I know it's not going to help everybody, but I know from, I did a TEDx a few years ago, and it got a lot of traction. It's been viewed a lot of times, but some of the messages on there about people changing their diets and getting well, and trying different things, and their stories have been really useful, I think, for a lot of people to know that it's not just you got to find your way and find what works well for you. And then on top of that, of course, make sure that you exercise and you sleep, meditate, breathe properly. Breathe. Yes, breathe. Get your breathing. Just slow down when you are feeling a little bit more anxious. There's lots of great apps out there. We're at a time where technology is really bringing a lot of things to us that wasn't possible 20 years ago. So there's a lot of hope that we can have a better future.
That's fantastic. Julia Rucklidge, thank you very much. Really appreciate you coming on. It was an absolute pleasure. Keep going with that wonderful work that you're doing.
Thank you.
I think it's amazing. And we might see you again sometime. Who knows?
Okay.
Just
Well,
to
thanks for
finish
having me.
there, guys, if anyone is watching this, Julia just mentioned there briefly, she has a TED Talk. I think, I mean, I'm not too sure. I think it's about 1.6 million views on that TED Talk. So worthwhile looking at that. But I'll be putting up a little bit where people can access your research and stuff like that. So that might be quite helpful to people that might have an interest in specific areas of the study and stuff like that. And Camille, thank you very much. Thanks again. I really appreciate it. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.